All right, so I just want to go over a couple of things. This is a really quick video. You should have a bag of Alja-safe, which is alginate. Okay, it's kind of a little bit more purple in color, and then you should also have a bag of Hydrocal or pottery number 1, which is plaster, which is heavier than the alginate if you lift one, and it should be labeled, but if you can't tell, you can usually tell by weight. So plaster, let's just set that aside. We're going to need that in a bit, and we want to kind of discuss a little bit about alginate first of all. So important thing is alginate. A couple of things about it. It's this is designed for prosthetic casting for use on the body. You don't want to ever use this in the mouth or anything. I mean, they do make dental alginate that is designed for that, but this is okay for use anywhere on the body. Its mix ratio is very simple. It's 1 part alginate powder to 1 part water. So you're going to need some mixing containers to kind of measure out the volume, and then you're going to probably need something to cast into. So in this case, for this demo, I'm just going to cast my fingers, and so I'm going to just use this cup. So one thing that's kind of tricky is trying to figure out how much volume you need to fill a container, which is something you kind of need to guess at a little bit. The more you kind of work with it, the more you can kind of figure that out, because you're dealing with a very lightweight powder and then a liquid of water, which they, when they're kind of dispersed in one another, they kind of don't, it isn't just like the volume of one thing and the volume of another added together. They kind of, the powder loses some of its volume when it's integrated with water. Anyhow, so you're going to have to calculate the volume, because that is important. I just want to very quickly kind of mention something, which is that the reason why that is important, because if you mix up some alginate and it's not enough, if you go to mix up some more alginate and then pour it on top of the alginate you already mixed, it will not stick. That's one of the mysteries of this material, is that it does not fuse with itself. You could make a mold with alginate of like your fingers, and then you could mix up alginate and pour that into the mold, and it would not stick to the object, or it would not stick to the mold. It would just come right out. So it's a very strange material in that way, but you have to kind of, especially when you're doing like a block casting or something, you have to kind of make sure that you have enough material to be able to produce your molds, so that you don't have to, add more later. The other thing that is really important to know about alginate is, in terms of mixing, it is the opposite of plaster. So with plaster, you always, and I will give you a little demo on that, you always start with the water and you sift the powder into the water. With alginate, you start with the powder and you pour the water into the powder. And just realize this material sets very quickly. So as I'm kind of producing this demo, it's, excuse me, as I'm producing this demo, you're gonna see I'm gonna be moving very quickly. Once I add that water to the alginate, I'm gonna kind of move real quick. All right, so that's just a few things to review. I've got a container which has 12 fluid ounces of water in it. So now I'm gonna open this up, and if you have a dust mask, I mean, anything that is going to be powder based, it's a good thing to use a dust mask when you're kind of working with it. So I'm going to be putting my powder into this container, which is calibrated as well, and trying to basically mix, or trying to put about the same amount of powder as water into the container. So I went a little bit over there. I don't want to pack it down, because you pack it down, you change the mix ratio. So that's pretty close. It might be just a hair under. I'll add a little bit more. And usually when you do block molds, I like to just add a little bit of extra water, because it makes the mixture a little bit more runny. Sorry, I'm just grabbing a mixing stick here. Okay, so now I've got equal parts powder and water. Okay, remember I said with this mixture, all you do is you have equal parts, and I'm going to close this up and get it out of the way just in case there's a splash or something. You got to, moisture will be attracted to this material, so you got to keep it sealed. So I'll tie that up afterwards. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add this water in there, and then I'm going to really vigorously mix it. And then this is what I'm going to cast my fingers in. And I'm going to fill this up and then stick my hand in. So let me put the water in there first. Let's see that, make sure that you can kind of see this. And you could mix this with your hand. You don't have to use a mixing stick, but I'm not wasting any time, just making sure that it is completely mixed. Okay, scraping the sides, and it's kind of like, it looks a little lumpy, but don't worry, it will absorb into those clumps. And all I'm going to do is transfer this into the container that I'm going to kind of cast my fingers in. All right, so it's you're not looking down on this, so you can't really see, but there's quite a bit of material. It's probably going to overflow when I stick my hand in there. Okay, so, and with hand casting, what I like to do is just kind of soak. I have a bucket of water off to the side here, and I just dip my hand into it so that it's not, doesn't have dry powder on it. And now I'm just going to, it's going to overflow, it's okay. Stick my fingers down into the mold. Okay, so then this is going to take probably about, I don't know, I'd say maybe 5 or 10 minutes for this to set up. And rather than me sitting here on camera the entire time, I think what I will do is pause it. So that it's not just dead time, or I can't pause it, but I'll start another video. Okay, so it's probably been about 10 minutes or so, and I have a little bit of the alginate on my fingers on this hand. You know, it's kind of a messy process, so you're going to want to put plastic down or something, but I can see that it's coming off my fingers. It's kind of gelled, and it's still kind of weak, right? So I want to be careful. But I kind of I moved my hand a little bit after I put it in there, because I realized I was kind of trying to fit too much of my hand into the cup. And so I'm going to just kind of start by removing some of that material. I want just to do this, it's still a little early. I want to just pull the material kind of away from my hand, so that what I want to happen is I want air to wick down in between the material and my hand. so that it'll release a little bit easier. That there's like, you know, it's stuck to, I mean, it's, you'll see it's very soft, so it's like if I wanted to, I could definitely pull my hand out of there, but I don't want to do it too abruptly because I'm wanting the material to kind of continue to cure before I don't want to tear it. So so I'm just kind of helping. You can kind of tell when it's set up, it gets a little bit more firm, and I'm kind of wiggling my fingers, trying to let the air kind of go down into the mold. And then I'm going to kind of, at a certain point very soon, I might be doing this a little prematurely, but I'm wiggling my fingers, trying to get that air down there. Kind of just, you can kind of feel when it pulls away from your skin when it's releasing. And now I'm just going to kind of slowly pull my hand out. So I've got a casting here. Sorry, I'm in the light. Like this was the kind of part that went up on my hand. Okay. So, and you're going to want to think through before you do this. I mean, it's okay to just kind of make some quick castings of fingers and stuff, but you're going to want to think through about like how big the container needs to be, what you want your hand to be doing, how much material you need. But so now this is a material that is you know, it's seaweed, it's like gelatin, and so it's not a permanent material. You've got to cast into it right away. So you don't want to kind of just walk away and say, oh, I'll cast into it tomorrow, because it will dry out, it will shrink, it will distort, and it also does other things, like it, for instance, begins at a certain point to kind of weep water a little bit. So you want to avoid that phenomenon. You can wear gloves with alginate if you want to. I mean, it peels right off your hands, and if I kind of wipe them off with a towel or something, that'll come right off. But so now here's the mold. That was very quick. And now we're going to mix up some Hydrocal. And we want to kind of try and calibrate how much material we're going to need to mix it up. So I'm gonna do that in a separate video and just show you how to mix up Hydrocal. And all we're gonna do is just pour it into the mold and then let it sit. All right, so plaster is a little tricky in terms of mixing. This is Hydrocal white, okay? And it has a different mix ratio than pottery number 1. The way in which plaster is usually mixed is in a ratio that has to do with weight. So Hydrocal technically is measured at 40 to 45 pounds for 100 pounds of Hydrocal. Okay, so that's kind of a crazy mix ratio, because you would have to have a scale in order to calculate the proper ratio every single time you mixed a batch. So there's a technique that they use in foundries, which is called the island technique. And basically you start off with water, so in this container, and what I've done is just to make things easier for you, I have, what do I have? I've got 4.5 ounces of H2O to, what is this? 8.5 ounces of plaster. Okay. So what I did, just to kind of illustrate my point here, to explain this to you, is you always start off with water, okay? And you have to think about how much water, how much material you need to mix up. And you start off with the water. And the water is, you know, probably going to be about half the material that you're going to end up with, right? So if I filled this container halfway with water and loaded it in, it would be way up here by the time I loaded all the plaster in. So you want to make sure that you're not adding too much water to start off. But the principle is pretty simple. You start off with water, and you don't want to go beyond half of the container of water, because then it'll overflow. So you start off with water, and you sift the plaster into the container. And what's going to happen, I don't know if you can see this, but if this is the container here, and I have a little video which I can show you on this, but and this is your water here, right? Sorry, it's a really clunky drawing, and you're looking at it kind of 3/4. You sift the plaster in, and it kind of goes to the bottom because it's heavy, and it builds up until it gets to the line of the water. and it won't, you know, as you're sifting the plaster in there, it won't go down anymore. And so what it does is it starts to kind of build up on the surface a little bit, and create even like something that looks like an island. And if you enlarge that, you'll even see the water trying to kind of climb up the surface of the material that won't settle into the bottom. So this is called the island technique. Sometimes it's a foundry technique. It makes mixing plaster a lot easier because you're basically just like displacing the water as you're sifting it in. So what I did is I weighed out 300, because it's a, you know, our mixed ratio was 45 pounds to 100 pounds of plaster. So what I did is I took my scale, and I started with plaster. I measured 300 grams of plaster, okay? And that is equal to 8.5 fluid ounces, okay, of material. And then in this container, since this is 300 pounds, I then calculated based upon the 45 pounds of water, you know, there are 300 pounds. So I did 135 grams of water. So technically, this ratio, which I gave you here, if you were wanting to mix up small batches, 4.5 fluid ounces of water equal to 8.5 fluid ounces of plaster, just as a general approximation. So now if I take this plaster, and you can do this by hand, but this is such a small container, and I sift it. Remember, you always start with the water, right? So I'm sifting into and maybe what I should do is move this over so you can see into the container. And I'm just gonna adjust the camera. So I'm sifting the plaster into the container, and it's settling, you know. So you can, once you get familiar with this technique, you can do this without weighing anything. You just start off with some water and sift the material and just watch the behavior of it until you see it peeking out of the surface. So like it's, you know, you see it's on the surface, but you see it settles. So it's not there yet. So as I'm sifting the material in, it is settling still, okay? Still, it looks like something's on the surface. No, it's settling still. It's really, you gotta kind of pay attention to how the material is kind of settling into the water, and it'll reach a point where it's completely displaced. So now you can see that the material is kind of at this point where it's not going down. You see how the water is kind of climbing up the surface and the material is not going down below, okay? So you can do this. There's quite a bit of variability in terms of how it mixed. If I added a little bit more plaster, it wouldn't be terrible. It would still set just fine. These ratios, like I'm gonna kind of just add a little bit more, you know, and it's still gonna set just fine. Where people have problems with plaster is when they kind of severely, like they do not put enough plaster into their water and they don't get anything like this, okay? So usually when you mix or you pour the plaster powder into the water, you want to give it like a minute or two to absorb the molecules of water into the powder. And then once you start mixing it, that is when the process of it casting, or of it starting to go through a catalyzation process will begin. So I'm going to pull this back here so that I can get the bigger picture in. Okay, so I'm going to kind of cheat this. So I could do this with my hands. Usually I like to mix plaster with my hands, but since I have this mixing stick here, I'm just going to start the process of mixing it. So plaster is really, it should be really creamy. If your batch is like, see how creamy that is? If it's like low-fat milk, then it's definitely not the right mixture. And you know, you don't just kind of give plaster a little mix like that. You really, really have to make sure it's mixed. So take like a good minute and a half or so and just mix it together, because it kind of wants to separate, like the water wants to separate from the stone, and you just want to make sure it's mixed really well. And then your mold is here, all ready to go. I'm just going to finish mixing this a little bit longer. Make sure you're scraping, getting all the material off the sides and off the bottom. And then I'm going to pour it into the mold. So sometimes with, let me make sure you can kind of see this. Let me pour that down. Sometimes with casting plaster into an alginate mold, you want to kind of really make sure that all the bubbles are out. Sometimes people will kind of dump the material out after they pour it in there initially, just to kind of make sure everything is kind of covered, and then pour it back in. So I'm going to actually just pour this all the way up to the top of the cup, because that will give me like sort of a base of plaster when I'm demolding it. Like it'll hold all the fingers together. So that's it. There's there is Hydrocal and casting your fingers in alginate, and I will demold it and show you the result. Oh, just, yeah, make sure, I'm sorry, make sure you're kind of getting, see all those bubbles coming up to the surface? Make sure you're getting the bubbles off, because bubbles have a tendency to sort of latch onto the surface. So you really want to make sure that you're getting that. Also, the other thing is, like, if you did something where your finger would be curling around like this in the plaster, like when you go to pour this, you're going to want to get air entrapment there. So in this case, you'd want to turn your mold and really make sure you pour the liquid in there. Make sure that the tips of the fingers are filling with the plaster first, and get it filled up, and then turn it down, or else you're going to have a huge air bubble in your finger, right? And then a large air bubble means you're going to have no fingertip. So anyways, just make sure this is filled up to the rim. So I don't want to, I need something to kind of tap it with. help those bubbles get out. And that's it.